Good afternoon and welcome to remote training. Make sure I wasn't muted. Sorry, everyone.
It's a mouthful, the title of this.
Yes, it is. Welcome to Remote Training Strategies for Employees with Disabilities in the Enterprise Environment. I'm Harris Rosenzweig, the Director of Accessibility for TCS Access.
Hi, and I'm Jeff Ermold. I'm the Director of Training for TCS Access.
And we're both very excited to be here today to talk about this topic for which I think we have a lot of deep knowledge on. And I think one of the most interesting things is that both Jeff and I hail from Philly.
Right. So, but we're not going to be talking Philadelphia Eagles. Don't worry about that.
No, but if you're
We'll
ever
stay
up
on
there,
topic.
if you're ever there, yeah, have a pretzel.
Have a cheesesteak. Right?
That's right. So Jeff and I will be taking us through the various discussion topics today. A little bit of housekeeping first. We are using the Zoom package. If you will, we have two ways for you to communicate with us, a couple ways actually. We have our chat box for those of you using keystrokes, Alt-H to open and access the chat box. If you want to raise your hand, that's Alt-Y. We really want to hear your voice. We want you to chime in on the various discussion topics today. We also do have live captioning. If you want to see those captions, you can click on the closed captions button near the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. We are recording the webinar and we will provide a transcript and the PowerPoint slides, and how you get all that information, the checklists and things that we'll have on our slides will be at the very end. Okay, so just some opening remarks. Jeff and I have been talking amongst ourselves for quite some time about this topic and our experience, and we've been eager to kind of put on a webinar that provides very concrete information on this topic during a time where both meetings and employee training are occurring virtually. You really need someone as an organization who can help coordinate the efforts to ensure that all of your employees who may or may not be using assistive technology have equal access to both these meetings and being trained. And this is an area that we've really spent a lot of time on. We have many partners in the government space. We work with the private sector, and this is exactly what we do in supporting not only the person with a disability, but the organization itself on this, sometimes complex topic. We do want to hear from you. We want to hear about your particular situations. If we can't get to all your questions today, we urge you to reach out to us. We'd be very happy to talk to you and to see how our organization might help. Jeff, let's maybe go through some of the webinar highlights.
Sure.
I've got our PowerPoint up. We're only going to refer to this PowerPoint a few times. I'm going to just advance to the next slides, but we're going to do this more through a dialogue and through hopefully interaction with you, the audience.
Yeah, and please feel free to chime in, just unmute your audio if you have a question. And we've also have allowed some time at the end for some questions. We'll kind of wrap this up, probably about 10 or 15 minutes before 2, so 2 Eastern time. So if you do have questions, but if something pops into your head, and it just feel free, or use the chat box feature. So yeah, just to kind of run through, we've kind of broken this into 6 main topic areas. First one is why implementing accessible remote training is really an essential part of the reasonable accommodations process. So it's kind of looking at holistically how we go about, why do we need to have a process for it? Why do we need a number of, people in the organization involved, a workflow process, that kind of thing, and we'll go into what that looks like. Second topic here is organizational communication prior to conducting remote assistive technology training. So we'll kind of go into that. Um, the next one is examining remote training for meetings and collaboration tools. You know, the different accessibility features, potential challenges, and so forth as these tools interact with the assistive technology for employees with disabilities. Fourth topic is assistive technology users and their need for training, specific training on the remote tools. Their experience can be a little bit different when you use assistive technology with these conferencing platforms. They do have a lot of accessibility built in, but there's often, this is often new technology and some additional tips and even prior training to being in a meeting or receiving training is helpful for users of assistive technology. So we'll talk through those aspects a little bit. Next, we will kind of the benefits and challenges of screen sharing and remote controlling features within these remote tools. So basically, you know, where have we seen some challenges? What kinds of workarounds and things have we done to get access using the assistive technology in a screen sharing or remote control kind of environment for training? And then the last one is sort of the common scenarios and challenges and when we use remote training tools with assistive technology. So those are kind of the very high level topics that we'll kind of go into detail with as we flow along here.
Absolutely, and we're going to narrow down very quickly, and we're going to be talking about specific situations as well. We want this to be as concrete as possible. So starting right in, we're going to have maybe some questions that Jeff and I kind of go back and forth on ourselves. Maybe it'll spark you. This first one. So why is it important to consider participation in virtual meetings and remote training on assistive technology as part of a reasonable accommodation?
Yeah, basically, it's a way of, it's just like any other process or function that you're providing in your organization. You know, and organizations vary depending on your resource, depending on your size, depending on the employees with disabilities that you have on your workforce. You know, we work with organizations that have very robust, multi-component kinds of AT organizations across the agency, large federal agencies and large corporations. We also, you know, there's other organizations that we work with that might just have a couple of users and they don't have the support mechanism, so they reach out to an organization like TCS Access to provide that level of support. But either way, it's important to really view the remote training and remote collaboration as just another part of your reasonable accommodations solution. So it needs to have that kind of emphasis in the organization.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jeff. And these things are actually codified. You know, if you're a government agency, you'd be concerned with Section 508 of the Rehab Act, specifically referring to non-public facing content. Anything that's internal training that you're providing would fall under that, and the need for accessibility. If you're a private sector, a corporation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, would come into play, in needing to ensure effective communication with persons with speech, hearing, and vision disabilities. So these things are there. There is direct reference to making sure that all of your employees have equal access to all of the communication within your organization.
Yeah, and adding the extra layer of remote access could add an extra barrier if it's not implemented properly and sort of cohesively across the organization. So it's really important to kind of think of that as this is another area where equal access is essential. And just like the accommodations were made in the physical office environment, there's different accommodations that need to be made in the virtual office environment.
That's right. And we wanted to just set the tone as a positive tone right off the bat. by saying, is it possible for employees with disabilities who may or may not use assistive technology to fully participate in virtual meetings and to be trained by a third party on their assistive technology?
Yeah, and the good news is yes, it's definitely possible. We are doing a lot of this on a regular basis, and actually have been doing this before much of the world went to this sort of new normal remote environment. So that's the good news. There's been a lot of progress made with the accessibility of the remote tools just in the last couple of years. Thankfully, for employees with disabilities, these platforms have become a lot more accessible prior to the pandemic and lockdowns and so forth. So yes, all these things are possible. Technically, it's more about how you implement them, what the processes are around those sorts of things.
Absolutely. That is the good news. You need a plan, though. You have to have a plan, and that's where we're going to drill down into next. We had some overarching statements to make. Is the importance of having buy-in from the highest levels of your organization. It's so important so that you can have a coordinated team effort. As Jeff will describe a little bit later, there are so many teams at times when you're dealing with the enterprise that have to be involved. This is one of the experiences I had with a federal agency that I was helping to manage their assistive technology programs for 10 years. All of the different internal teams that had to be brought together to solve some of the issues related to assistive technology, and this is no different. And then lastly, the need for flexibility. Talk about the need to be flexible in the age of COVID-19, and where we're forced to do things in a slightly different way.
Yeah, and that could mean a number of different things. That could mean that there might be a different product, whether that be an AT product, mainstream software product, or if it's even possible, a different remote tool. Not all, and we'll get into this later, but not all remote tools, even though they all now have accessibility features, those accessibility features were really designed for accessing the tool itself, the user interface, and the features within the tool. In terms of you're adding that extra layer now of complexity with the assistive technology, whether it be a JAWS or Dragon or Zoom Text or what have you, that's where all tools do not behave the same and all tools are not created equal. So being flexible, being open if it is possible, and again, some organizations it's not possible, to trying different products, different solutions, that's very important.
Yes. So Jeff, let's maybe drill down to maybe our first discussion topic. We broke this into basically two areas, even though they're very related in some ways. The first one being how to ensure equal access for your employees who want to attend virtual meetings. If someone was coming to us to TCS Access as an enterprise, and they're like, well, how do we make sure our employees do have access? Where do we begin? So that's where we would have this, and I have up on one of the PowerPoint slides, which I'm not going to read from. We're just going to discuss what are, there's a whole checklist of things that we might ask you to start off with, and Jeff and I will get into that here. So, we might start off with what platform are you actually using? What kinds of meetings are you having? What kinds of information are you trying to transmit? What features are being used within the meeting? In this meeting, we have a chat box going. I have several windows open. We have the ability to hand raise. We have polls that could be taken in Zoom. In the Zoom meeting. I'm not doing that today, but suppose they were. Do your staff have the training or the knowledge on how to use all those features, how to accept an invite for the meeting, or maybe how to generate the meeting themselves?
Right, it's very important to think about the audience and what their role is what level of participation they need. I think a lot of emphasis is always, and rightly so, placed on the presentation of the meeting and the content of the meeting, but how do the attendees access that information? Maybe they use a screen reader, maybe they might need materials in Braille, in refreshable Braille. They might use magnification software. So just thinking about all the different permutations, there's a lot of increasing amount of data coming out that all of the remote meetings and collaboration projects that we're all involved with is very draining. The data is showing that it's more draining than if you would just to attend a few Zoom meetings every day than if you were in a full day of intense, in-person meetings, if you were in a conference room, say. So it's a whole different way that our brains are processing this information. And then if you add again the layer of assistive technology on top of that, you can imagine it could be a draining or frustrating experience if that person, the employee with a disability, isn't really factored in ahead of time.
That's so true. There's all of these factors to consider. If you are going to be sending reference documents, reference materials, can you send those out ahead of time? And of course, to make sure that those documents, maybe they're Microsoft Office documents, maybe they're PDFs, whatever they are, that they're accessible. And maybe you're not even aware of what that means. And you need some expertise in that area. And then to talk about persons who are deaf or hard of hearing, do you have a process around ensuring persons who are deaf have the opportunity to request, say, a sign language interpreter? It's one thing, we do have the captions going here to have that going in real time, but you may prefer in your native language, which for some might be American Sign Language, to see the workshop done that way.
Even simple things like keystrokes, shortcut keys, that can save someone a lot of time and aggravation to be able to move quickly, say, to the chat window, where they might be wanting to participate and realize, oh, their microphone is muted. Well, there's a quick way in most of these platforms to mute and unmute, to do all these kinds of common functions. But again, it might take some upfront research into what those accessibility features are, and then talk with the person who is using the assistive technology, give them that information, and see if that meets their needs.
That's right. And I can't stress enough, if you've done these yourself, these types of Zoom meetings, that the way that you communicate has to change. If you have something up on the screen, we have a PowerPoint slide up here describing some of these points that we're going over right now. So there are different ways in which you need to communicate with your audience if you're not there in person for them.
One other one, Harris,
Sure.
is involved with screen sharing. And again, if you have participants that are blind or low vision, and you're sharing a presentation, sharing a document, describing that information, maybe having them have access to it locally, emailing it ahead of time, and just being aware of how you convey that information.
That's right. So there is a whole checklist of things that you can do before the meeting, in advance, giving people notice of the format of the meeting, that they can maybe send their questions in advance, sending out the documents in advance, making sure that you've lined up either the sign language interpreter or the captioner. You're good to go with all of those things, and that you're fully prepared, maybe with a list of hotkeys that are available in that particular package. One other thing, Jeff, we were talking about just before we started was the home environment. Is that something you wanted to mention here?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It can easily get overlooked, but if an employee has had a reasonable accommodation or a number of accommodations approved for the office environment, suddenly those accommodations might not be available. And this could, and particularly on the hardware side of things, thinking about things like ergonomic keyboards, a docking station, speakers, a good headset, depending if they do dictation, speech recognition. Dual monitors, really valuable for a low vision user. Often low vision users will split an image where they can either extend the screen that they're working on across the two monitors, or they can even split so they're working with a document, say, in a magnified view on one screen and working with another application on another screen. And it's important for most employers. Dual monitors is a pretty standard setup in most offices these days, but for someone with low vision, it's extremely valuable. So those kinds of things, as much as possible, accommodating the home environment as much as, again, some things, the desks are going to be different, the chairs are going to be different, those kinds of things, but as much as possible, accommodating, that home environment so it mirrors what was going on in the office environment.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Jeff. For some of us, and including folks who work in the school system, they literally like ran out the door and they didn't even have time to take their computers with them.
Right.
So let alone being able to grab what you had at your work office and bring it home. Excellent points. I also wanted to mention to do dry runs, to make sure you are working with your employees. Certainly you want to do all this legwork ahead of time around the technical aspects of your platform, but include your employees themselves in dry runs of making sure that they do have access when they're joining that meeting, that they're not experiencing any glitches. And this is where it might be helpful if you don't have a dedicated staff person at your organization who works specifically on assistive technology issues, to have a consultant to work with you. Jeff, I thought we'd pause at this point just on this discussion topic of employees with disabilities in the enterprise trying to access virtual meetings. Would anyone like to chime in? You can either raise your hand or first, and we can call on you. Again, that's Alt-Y. If anyone, or if you want to put in the chat box a question that I can read out.
Alt-A to unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Jeff.
And yeah, if you've had success stories, horror stories, things that you're struggling with to accommodate, we'd be interested in hearing those.
I always like a good horror story.
Yeah, that's right. We like challenges.
Yes. I'm just keeping my eye on the chat box here just to see. We'll give you a moment. Don't be shy. Sometimes I know people are a little sensitive to talk about issues in their own organizations or other organizations. They don't want to call anyone out, so I get that as well. We have in the chat box here, Jeff, from Gary Moran, just looking for a simple handout to give to event planners or meeting planners on pre-planning for meeting online virtual. Well, I would hope our PowerPoint would be a start in that, but we can actually codify that into a document for you as well. So that'll be an excellent thing to have a checklist.
Hi, this
planning
is
their meeting.
At Metro. I couldn't get my Alt-Y to work, so I don't know if you can hear me.
You'll have to take that, Jeff.
Yeah, I hear you. Loud and clear. Go right ahead.
So we've done a great deal of experimentation because we run our accessibility advisory committee all over people with disabilities, and I've been having my own challenges. We've tested like 6 different systems, from Zoom to WebEx to Skype, Teams to Blue Jeans to go to a meeting.
Right.
And the one we've ever successfully got all people with disabilities on is Zoom. And unfortunately, Metro is moving towards Teams now. enterprise, and I have yet to be able to make a successful connection to make Teams work with JAWS.
You're right on the money. Teams, in terms of actually having access to the JAWS audio, we've seen the same thing. That is not an ideal tool for working with a JAWS user if that audio needs to be coming through, the Teams platform. Yeah.
Right. I mean, with all of these, I've still never figured out how I can get JAWS to read what people are sharing on the screen with me. Is there any of them that allow that?
Well, why don't we do this? Maybe we can chat about this afterwards. Yeah, it gets a little bit technical, but we have an accessibility lab here, so we've tested all the different platforms with all the different types of assistive technology. So, did you say you're with Metro?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and so as the organization switches exclusive, is that an exclusive Teams? In other words, other remote tools will not be available, even on there can be an exception basis for certain users?
Well, we've gotten an exception to use Zooms for our AAC meetings,
Okay.
not internally. So that's the challenge. And of course, they have no training on using it with JAWS.
Sure, sure. And you're kind of, you could be doing this presentation actually. That's kind of what we're going to address also. There's definitely a level of training that's often needed for the assistive technology user. So why don't we chat afterwards, and we'll put up our contact information at the end here too. We can even arrange some time we can chat maybe next week on the phone.
Yeah, that'd be good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Great question.
Hi, Jeff Harris. This is Maurice Crittenden. So I had a quick question, a couple of quick questions. One, as in referring to the last question, do you recommend that some users, such as visually impaired users like myself, would use the mobile applications? I'm finding the mobile app for both Zoom and Teams is pretty useful. And then when there are messages that appear in the chat, if your voiceover is turned on, it will read those off. And then the second, for participants, what do you recommend if they are visually impaired and can't necessarily see the presentation, but other people want to kind of see everybody in the gallery view and to get visual feedback? What type of recommendations do you have for participants in those cases?
Okay. Well, for the first question, yeah, absolutely. I think, again, it's sort of being flexible and creative. Both those tools, Teams and Zoom, are very accessible both on the desktop side and on the remote versions of those products, whether they be iOS or Android. So they are very, and there can be some advantages. I think you point out a great one in that automatic reading of that kind of status information, that anything that's dynamic, whether it be comments or status changes. The desktop side of say Zoom will let you know as participants join and leave a meeting and so forth. But unless you're focused on a particular area, if you want to monitor the chat, you have to make sure you're focused in that area. It's not going to come across to you, let's say, if you're in another window. So it's basically, yeah, the theme for all of this is definitely individual. It's even more individual than your normal accommodations approach because, again, there's so many tools. There's no, I wish I could say to you today that here's the tool, here's the magic tool, and it'll work beautifully with all forms of assistive technology, and here's how you implement it. But we're not there. There are, very accessible ways if there's flexibility there. And so your second question, let me make sure I understand it. Are you talking about accessing something that's being screen shared?
So no, and for general meetings, either a lot of meetings now have they moved virtual, will just be on Zoom or on
Sure.
Teams, and the visual aspect is still greatly appreciated by many. but for some individuals that might not be best suited, as in placement in the viewfinder and so forth. So what would you recommend in those cases?
Okay. So in other words, if you're a visually impaired user, how you are seen by the other participants?
Yes,
If
that's
you're
it.
if you're on camera and that sort of thing?
Yes.
You want to take that, Harris? It's a, you know, I'm blind myself, so it's a bit of a trial and error kind of a thing. That I think when you do these frequently, you kind of get a sense of how to position your screen and your camera, and you can kind of just duplicate that if you're sitting in the same desk, the same height, the computer's in the same place, the screen is tilted at the same angle, that sort of a thing. But I'm not aware, it's a
I
great.
wouldn't add anything to that. If that's really getting to the crux of your question, it really, getting into the same environment, the same height of the camera. Jeff and I did a little bit of that before we got on to make sure his positioning was okay. We're in the office today at a different table height. Is that getting at the heart of your question?
Yep, it sure is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think you came up with a great product design idea. There could be some sort of auditory, a little beacon that would notify somebody that, hey, you're right in the middle of the viewfinder. But
hey, Jeff, we had a couple of
sure.
comments in the chat, the group chat. I'm just going to pick up on a theme that you brought up yourself, where Gary said, yeah, this surge of online platforms, Teams live stream and all the others is overwhelming to keep up with. Exactly. And figuring out which features are available in which and how accessible they are. And we're experiencing that across the board as our different customers are coming to us on how they do the remote training. We did have another question here that I think may segue us into our next topic from Leanne Stanfield. Do you have any insight into the accessibility for Skype for Business and whether there are any known issues? Maybe, Jeff, we could segue into the next topic and then kind of cover that, because that's as far as when you're concerning training of on assistive technology. So, so what is needed if you have a third-party trainer who needs to train one of your employees with disabilities at your enterprise on their assistive technology? Well, if I'm an assistive technology trainer and I'm working remotely, there's 2 or 3 things that I absolutely want. One, of course, is the ability to see the other person's screen. Now, if I was a blind trainer, I wouldn't necessarily need that as much, but I would want to have the ability to hear their audio, the audio coming from their computer. I would also ideally like the ability to remotely control their computer. Okay, that's not necessarily a showstopper, but it's really ideal. If I'm not able to sit next to you and to grab your mouse or to hit a keystroke to send a box away that I didn't want, I sure would like to be able to remotely control your computer, along with many other reasons. So based on those prerequisites of the most fundamental things you'd want as a trainer, you'd want to first investigate, does our conferencing platform have those capabilities? Most of them do, but the caveat is if I'm a third party and I'm not on your network, I'm not on the inside, I'm not inside your firewall, what's that going to look like? And this is where, we've had a lot of experience lately. We can't necessarily pull out of our hat a nice, neat table of the 9 different platforms and which ones work, but we can give you a format, a process for how you would go through this, and you may have already started this, and we do want to hear from you. So Jeff, I was wondering if you want to
Sure, yeah.
on that.
No, this is a kind of right in our wheelhouse. We've been dealing with this again prior to the pandemic and the shift to remote work, but it's really accelerated, obviously. And the reality is that most of these platforms were used as needed, but certainly not as in most organizations, at least not as a mission critical kind of thing. Now they're mission critical, so that an organization has invested into a particular conferencing platform, and that's deployed across the organization, and it varies what criteria was put into that. But the reality is those questions that must-haves that Harris mentioned in terms of remote controlling, seeing the video, hearing the audio, by and large, those were not tested with assistive technology before making that decision. But so that's kind of where we are. And again, it gets complicated. There's a lot of tools out there, and there's a lot of different permutations. So we won't go into all the different scenarios. The question was about Skype. We have worked with agencies with Skype for Business. It's a bit of an older platform at this point. Microsoft is kind of shifting people into Teams, but there's still a lot of enterprises that have Skype for Business out there. Some of the agencies that we've worked with Skype for Business, we have seen limitations for audio. So for JAWS training, that can be a challenge for the audio to be played remotely. And we've even seen some controlling issues where not all keystrokes or mouse clicks are submitted to the target computer, the computer that's being controlled. So, these are just sort of why this is a more complex process than a lot of times I think people realize. But there are a number of steps that you can do. If it's possible to have multiple platforms or to have exceptions, we can recommend a solution that does have those, that access, say, for a JAWS user, or a magnification user, or a Dragon user. And if there's not an exception, then we just sort of have to be creative with how we interact with that user. A lot of times, though, what we see is just kind of walk through some of the experiences we've had with federal agencies. We do training for large federal agencies, both here in the DC area at headquarters, but we also do it in field offices all over the country, hundreds of field offices. And we've been doing this training for a number of years. So our trainers have security clearances, they have badges, they can access these buildings, they can access the trainees' environment. They can work with them on their workstation and even have access to the workstation. All these things have been ironed out in the physical environment. But when we shifted to the virtual environment, what we found is that the mechanisms that were in place to make it happen on site were not there for the remote environment in many cases. So in a very secure agency, what we ran into is we had to make some adjustments to the security clearance. We had to change the access that our trainers had with their encrypted cards, with their PIV cards, so that the card now needed to associate with things like VPN access with certain domains on the network. And those weren't granted when our initial program started, because the assumption was the training was going to be on site in the offices. So again, a lot of different components, and that's where we keep hammering this idea of collaboration and upfront planning. But that's really to make it work best is to have all the different components, and those components typically are the IT group, the help desk. If you're a large organization, they might even have a help desk, a regular help desk, and a help desk for assistive technology users. The reasonable accommodations office, of course, the direct supervisor or manager of the employee with the disability. All these different and the security office, they play a large part in that, because again, you're granting different levels of access that the trainer didn't have before. So as much as possible, if those groups can be planning up front and then develop a process where we've seen that's where we've seen it work best, where we've seen the challenges and quite frankly, less than optimal service for an employee with a disability is when it's kind of a trial and error process, where one of the trainers has a new, an updated card, but the card does not have all the access that's needed. So then we're going back and forth with the security office, and then we're going back with the contracting office, and all these kinds of things we've seen, and the result of that is that the person who needs this reasonable accommodation of training, their trainings just keep getting delayed. So something that might have only taken a couple of weeks might now take a couple of months, and they're still waiting for their service. So, a coordinated effort is the best approach.
Absolutely, Jeff. That's so well put in that an example of a very large federal agency, all of the hoops that you had to jump through, and again, reinforcing the need to have the buy-in from the very highest levels, because you do have all of those disparate groups, those internal teams, stakeholders, and making sure they're communicating with each other. There's a clear plan of action so that you can get to the point where you can actually do some of that trial and error testing with your platform, so that you can get to that state that you want to be able to provide your employee with the training that they need. A couple of the things that come to mind, again, if you don't have a dedicated AT specialist working at your organization, you may want that consulting, you may want that input for how these programs, these assistive technology programs actually operate. Someone to do the dry runs with maybe some of the IT people, the IT help desk people. When it comes to figuring out what kind of assistive technology, even down to that level, that your employee may need, you may need someone who's skilled in that area. It's not always easy to determine, does this person need screen magnification or a screen reader, or maybe they need both, or are they having dexterity issues? Do they need something like a Dragon speech recognition program? Maybe they have low vision on top of that. So how well do these programs, screen magnification and Dragon, play together? And then you're adding the remote program on top of that. So there's identifying the assistive technology, and then, well, how many hours of training will a person need to be able to perform the essential functions of their job once we've even done all of that? And that's where you really need a skilled AT specialist, AT trainer who can kind of lead you through that dialogue, that conversation. And then, as Jeff was mentioning, we're in a different world here. People get exhausted. You can't necessarily train for 6 hours remotely in the same way that you might have been able to do when you were with them in person. So there are all of these factors. Getting down to the granular level, Jeff, with speaking directly to, say, Dragon and JAWS, Dragon, the speech recognition, the JAWS, the screen reader for a blind person, and say like a Zoom text or other screen magnification program. There are some particular challenges there if I'm the trainer. Jeff, did you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, the ideal scenario is if the trainer can essentially simulate the same environment that the person is having. So, if it is something like a screen magnification tool, can they see what the user sees, down to the magnification level, the mouse pointer, the color contrast, all the different settings. Can they see how the user is using that? Again, some of the remote tools allow that, some of them don't at all. So it takes a skilled trainer then, to understand. Again, the example I mentioned with Dragon, very common with our Dragon trainings to write custom commands. The ideal way to do that is to truly interact with the trainee's computer so that you're writing to the applications they're using. In these environments, as you know, the bulk of the training we do is in proprietary applications. So these are complex applications. A lot of them have moved to a web-based kind of interface, but we're teaching the employee how to use these proprietary applications with their assistive technology. So you know, you never train assistive technology in a vacuum. You never just say train JAWS or train Dragon or train Magic, Zoom Text or Magic. So that gets, again, a little bit more challenging. You want to hopefully have as much access to the environment as possible. And you know, there's even scenarios that we've run into where we've needed to reach out. We have some good relationships with the AT manufacturers, all the major AT manufacturers, and we've talked with product management and tech support to see, you know, well, is there a workaround for this? Can we get access to this information? What happens often is the AT tools are in conflict with how the information is being outputted. So they're sort of battling for access. And again, not to get too technical, but we have found some pretty unique workarounds, or we might find out that, hey, that, you know, there's a patch in JAWS coming down that solves this solution. So we can, you know, we can go back to the agency and say, you know what, you can stick with that platform because next month there's going to be you know, a fix for this issue. So it's a complex environment, but you know, that's what we love to do, and
Yep.
I'd be happy to help you with that.
Yeah, just to maybe add a few other points that are coming to mind as you're talking about some of the nuances of each one. You know, as a trainer, and you're training someone who's Dragon, and I have the great benefit of the experience of my good colleague Ben Soto, who's been assistive technology trainer with us for I think around 10 years now. Mentioning the challenges of training someone who may be using the same microphone to talk to you, say over Teams,
Right.
as they are dictating with their Dragon, and then teaching them how to mute and unmute their microphone so that you're able to train them, or maybe you're talking to them on a separate phone line. I remember talking to Ben recently about an experience he had. I think he was using Teams and the other person was using Zoom Text. And whenever they were turning on their various features, he wasn't able to see that they've magnified the screen, that they've changed the color contrast, they've changed the mouse pointer. At one point, the mouse pointer disappeared completely for Ben as the trainer. Didn't disappear for the user. It disappeared for Ben. So Ben couldn't see. So as an AT trainer, you need to be able to work around some of these things and be able to just work blind in quotes when you're not able to see everything you would like to see as if you were sitting next to that person.
Yeah, and that's why we partner with a lot of these agencies. You know, the larger agencies have you know, a pretty robust AT support program where they might have staff dedicated, help desk staff, training staff, and so forth. But again, if you're not that kind of an agency, you want to reach out and get that expertise, you know, to people that are living this every day, because it can be complex and it's a drain on time and resources. And ultimately, the most important thing is it's what delivers the services, you know, best to the end user.
We're at 1:48, Jeff. I do want to take some time to take a few more questions, but I also, at the risk of running out of time, should I quickly go over the third category of training employees and groups, or do you think I should take some questions first?
We can do a quick run through of the group training.
Okay, yeah. So this is kind of like the third area. We've been asked by our partners, our various agencies who want training for their staff on select topics, say in web accessibility on the mobile platform or desktop platform, or on document accessibility. We have some really good workshops, 1- and 2-day workshops on those topics that we've given before, and then we've given them in person. But now we're being asked to do them remotely. So there are some considerations there. We don't want to dwell too much on that. We want to keep it on more on the assistive technology side. But some of the challenges you might want to think about is, the size of the group that you're training. It's a little harder to train the same number of people that you would in person as you would remotely, and keep everyone engaged. Jeff was talking about the issue of having 2 monitors earlier. It's a common way of working for a lot of people, and especially if you're visually impaired, that might be a good option. But if you're training people in a workshop, say, and you want them to do exercises, where you want them to work on creating an accessible PDF in Adobe, but you also want them to keep listening to you as the instructor who's using Zoom or whatever, Google Meet or whatever platform. There's some challenges there to allow them to not get distracted and be able to switch between those 2 windows. And there's some other details about how you handle the reference materials that are being used within that workshop, and where they're stored and how people access those in real time. And maybe you want people to be using some assistive technology during that workshop, because maybe you're showing them how a screen reader works and how it interacts with a web page. So there's more logistics, but it all can be done. You need a process, you need those checklists, and that's something that I think we can help you with. And some of these PowerPoint slides we've put together, and we can put them together as Word documents as well, that we can send out at the end of this. Did want to open it back up to if you wanted to either raise your hand or chime in, and we can call on you, or type your question in the chat box. Could be on anything related to training your employees on assistive technology, or having equal access to virtual meetings. Give people a moment to think if they have any other thoughts or questions there.
And just one other thing I wanted to stress again, it's really important to make sure before providing any of these services, whether it be meetings or training, that the user of assistive technology has specific training on the tool. It's not as seamless. The interfaces for most of these tools are very user friendly, and they're fairly intuitive. Most people just click, or if you're on a mobile device, you just tap and, oh, I see how it does that. But it's not quite as immediate or as intuitive if you're adding the layer of assistive technology. So again, to provide that equal access, make sure that some upfront training or investigation is done, so that somebody is not in a meeting or receiving training and just doesn't feel that so they don't feel lost, so they don't feel like they're not getting the same level of experience.
Jeff, I've got a comment here, very interesting, from Leanne Stanfield. Leanne, I'm happy to have you speak yourself. I'll read your question, though. We are currently getting over 30,000 colleagues through mandated e-learning. Wow, that's a couple. A percentage of these colleagues use screen readers, and we are now identifying numerous issues. We are currently collating the issues and potential resolutions, but this could end up with multiple solutions, which may or may not be possible. Is there common solutions that meet multiple needs? So this is interesting. I'm assuming you're referring to, is there a common, my IT blocks me speaking, won't connect the mic. Okay. So I'm assuming you're talking about some of these e-learning platforms. There's a couple different companies that put them out, and that would be like its own accessibility testing issue. So it would be interesting to find out what the platform is, and a lot of companies put out these statements of accessibility. You may have heard the term VPAT, Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, that says that it's 508 compliant, but when you actually start using it, the specific features aren't all accessible. So this is so huge. This was huge before the pandemic hit. The accessibility of e-learning platforms, because that has become the norm in the universities and federal government. And unfortunately, you have to take it on a program by program basis, and you would have to reach out to that company and to engage them regarding these issues. It's great you're documenting them, but there is a set process for testing applications for accessibility and documenting that, whether you guys have the expertise or if you want to call in an AT professional who does that kind of testing.
Yeah, and we can chat if you want to reach out afterwards. Again, we can chat through that. We do have some experience with on e-learning platforms in federal agencies and large organizations. Like Harris said, it's there's definitely an emphasis on accessibility, but then it comes down to the implementation. You know, how it can even come down to how the organization implements video training, interactive training, testing, those kinds of things. And it sounds like you're on the right track. You sometimes literally need to do screen by screen or application by application testing just to get a sense of you know, the problem areas. But usually when they're deemed accessible, that sort of means that at a 50,000 foot level, they're accessible for the main user interface and the main functions. But once the organization starts building its content in, that's when it gets pretty complicated. So, but we can, yeah, I'm happy to chat with you about that offline.
Yes. Excellent topic. It could be its own webinar right there on
Absolutely.
accessibility of e-platforms. Maybe we'll do that. But we do have some partners in the industry as well who have some other specializations in these areas. Give another moment. It's 1:57. We have another, maybe time for another question. If not, we can try to summarize some of the high points of what we've been talking about here. I think we've said it at least a couple of times, that the need for the highest level management engagement in these things to make sure that they get across the finish line. As Jeff mentioned, there's a lot of different internal stakeholders and groups that are involved, just so you can get to the point where you can do that remote training with your employee or have them participate in your meeting as you wish.
Yeah, the key is just collaboration, upfront planning, and really develop a workflow. And then, you know, when all of that is ironed out, then you can just repeat that process. But and it's going to have wrinkles. It's going to have variance because people are using different technologies, and it even comes down to their job functions and those needs. But just in terms of actually implementing basic access for meetings, basic access for remote training, you know, use those best practices, really bring all the people, all the stakeholders involved, develop that workflow process, you know, up front, and then go from there.
I'm skipping over a couple of the PowerPoint slides to the very end where we have, and Jeff is the winner as far as getting your questions and comments and follow up from here. He's Jeff at tcsaccess.com. That's Tango Charlie Sierra, tcsaccess.com. Jeff?
Yep, happy to chat with you. We flipped a coin and actually won. So
yes.
I'm happy to chat through. There's some really challenging scenarios, and I'm sure there's more of them out there. So no pressure. Just feel free to reach out, and you know, we can hopefully get you in the right direction.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Talking about this issue. We have an ocean of knowledge in this. We're, as I say, we're the best little company no one's ever heard of in this space. But we've been doing this for over 30 years with all disabilities in such an amazing variety of settings. So thank you for your participation. It's 2 o'clock. I think we'll end it there. I'll leave up the PowerPoint slide for a moment.
Okay, thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.